Good morning, crime community. I'm continuing to read out The Power of Her Sympathy on Catharine Maria Sedgwick. The introduction is by Mary Kelley. The marriage of Theodore Sedgwick illustrated the persistence of older patterns of generations' relations. Before he had reached the age of 28, Theodore had married twice, enhancing his status both times. His marriage to Eliza Mason, the member of the prominent family in Franklin, Connecticut, was crossed by tragedy. When he complicated smallpox 3 years after his marriage, Theodore immediately removed himself from the household and returned only after he had been certified as recovered. The precautions notwithstanding, Eliza, whose pregnancy had made inoculation advertisable but infected, the smallpox that her husband had barely survived killed her. Although Sedgwick believed the only canonized year and a day that elapsed before her parents' marriage, Theodore actually married Pamela Dwight in 1774, 3 years after Eliza's death. Whatever their individual differences, Eliza and Pamela's both practiced the deference toward Theodore that traditional gender relations mandated, and so as to signify the widely roles she and Eliza shared, Pamela enshrined the memory of her predecessor in the name of her eldest daughter, Eliza Mason. The characterization, her mother as modest, humble, and reserved, Sedgwick described the posture that Pamela adopted toward her husband. The negotiations between Pamela and Theodore, when the latter was decided whether to continue his political career, as illustrative in a letter that Sedgwick included in the autobiography. Pamela suggested that her husband consider the toll exacted by his career, telling Theodore in the last part of the 1780s that a wish to serve the true interests of our country is certainly a laudable ambition. She immediately added that the intention brings many cares with it. With a striking ease and confidence, she commented on the political remedies that her husband faced in the waning years of the 18th century. The government was as yet untried. The citizenry was yet untested. However, both the ease and the confidence disappeared when she came to costs that mattered most to her. She could only say, only hesitantly, that her family deserved some attention. She could not say at all that she merited consideration. I have not distant wish you could sacrifice your happiness to mine in your inclination to my opinion. Instead, should Theodore decide to continue to pursue a career that took him away from his family at least half of a year, Pamela duly assured him that the submission of my duty, and however hard I will try to practice that reason, teaches me that I am under obligation to do so. At the top of the letter, she was deposited with the family correspondence at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Sedgwick wrote in her own hand a beautiful and characteristic letter from my beloved mother, wise and tender. Her daughter's sentiments notwithstanding, Pamela found the separations from her husband very hard indeed. Sedgwick herself acknowledged that her mother had been left for many months in the cold northern country with young children, a large household, and complicated concerns and the necessity of economy. Pamela's letters to her husband focused upon the isolation, the longing for companionship that made the separation still more difficult. Indeed, her letters were a litany of loneliness. Theodore's departure occasioned a very sensible plan, although she tried to conceal it so not to distress him, disappointed that his return was displayed yet again, and she told him in another letter, I sicken at the thought of your being absent for so long a time. She found almost intolerable the veil of widowhood. Perhaps most intelligently, Pamela confided in still another letter, we are all like a body without a soul. The cost of separation increased as Pamela's already fragile health became more precarious and her struggle with depression more desperate. In December 1791, she pleaded with her husband to return home and the next morning ordered him to stay away. The letter was short. It told Theodore she was sunk deeply into herself. Friends had tried to tell her that she was ill, but this I have no reason to believe. Yet as the words tumbled from her pen, she made Theodore believe, but can I tell you that I have lost my understanding? What was she to think? And could she think? She wondered, what is the shame? That is my pen. What is my confusion to think is what Evils await my poor family without a guide, without a head. She wanted him to return for the children, for their sakes, but surely not for his or for hers. For your sake, I wish you not to come and must not come. I would only make us both more wretched. Although Pamela rallied from the attack, others that followed were still more severe. In a letter that Sedgwick included in her autobiography, Theodore told his other daughters, Eliza and Frances, that as Pamela's condition deteriorated, he had struggled to decide whether to remain in Congress or resign his office. I most sincerely endeavored to weigh all circumstances and to discover what I ought to do. Theodore continued his career. Pamela continued to suffer increasingly serious attacks of depression until her death in 1807. Ostensibly, Sedgwick defended her father's decision, declaring in the autobiography that Theodore's letters had been filled with the most thoughtful love of my mother, the highest appreciation of her character, claiming the only devotion to his country had been the persist in his career. Sedgwick stressed that her father had felt it to be his duty to remain in public life at every private sacrifice. Perhaps most important, Pamela's sufferings had ended with her death, and his daughter insisted Theodore's contribution to establish a government and to swell the amount that politicians' virtue, which makes the history of the federal party the record of the purest patriotism the world has ever known, that remains. Simultaneously, however, Sedgwick subverted this defense to her father. In some of the most moving passages in her autobiography, she tallied the cost of Theodore's choice. Surely the largest toll had been extracted from Pamela. Acknowledging the pain her mother had suffered, Sedgwick noted that the separation seemed to have been almost cruel to her. She had been oppressed with cares and responsibilities. She had borne the terrible weight of domestic cares, but Sedgwick did not stop there. The daughter also exposed her own deeply ambivalent response. It also had her litany. There was the recollection of her initial words of a child Theodore and Philadelphia, words that signified, felt really of her father's absence. This was the deliberate lineage of childhood sorrows and joys where Papa's going away and Papa's coming home. There was this impassioned statement about the suffering she had endured at the time of Pamela's death. Beloved mother, she explained, even at this distance of time, I thought of what I suffered when you died, thrills my soul. And there was the decision to include the wretchedly powerful eulogy penned by her brother Harry shortly after Pamela's death. He testified to his mother's endurance, declaring that her suffering in degree and duration has been perhaps without a parallel. Harry emphasized that she had nonetheless displayed an invincible meekness and gentleness of her heavenly temper. Meekness, gentleness is the word. Subordination highlighted the gender relations that Pamela practiced. It was the cost inherent in those relations that led Sedgwick to undermine the defense of her father. Unable to elude the evidence of her ambivalence, Theodore and Pamela's daughter scattered its traces through the text of her autobiography. Theodore's absence and Pamela's illness obliged Catharine to look elsewhere for daily care, support, and guidance. She found all and more of that in Elizabeth Freeman, an African American who was the family servant for 26 years. In the passage of the autobiography that described Ma Bet or Mum Bet, Sedgwick remarked to Alice that those who surrounded us in our childhood, whose atmosphere unfolds us, as it were, have nothing more to do with the formation of our characters than all our didactic and perspective education, as it was Mumbet's perception of justice, just her uncompromising honesty, her conduct of high intelligence, and that the undeniable impression in Theodore's and Pamela's daughter. When Sedgwick described my mother, my nurse, my faithful friend, in a volume of her journal, she recorded that the same impression in an entry made only a month before Mumbet's death on 28 December 1829, Sedgwick mentioned that the strong love of justice and the incorruptible integrity and the intelligent industry, all of which she later noted in her autobiography, the characteristics highlighted in her journal, also suggested exceptional strength, determination, and force. Mumbet exhibited strong judgment. She had iron resolution and demonstrated quick and firm decision. Embodying a power that set her apart from the other individuals in the autobiography and the journal, Mumbet emerged as the most exceptional individual, regardless of sex. More tellingly, she emerged as the woman with whom Sedgwick most deeply identified, and in turn, Sedgwick declared, Mumbet had clung to us with a devotion and tenacity of love seldom equaled. Significantly, however, Sedgwick was oblivious to the structural limitations of her relationship with the beloved Mumbet. The individual that Sedgwick inscribed in the autobiography and her journals appeared as an icon, presented as if untouched by the disabilities of the radically based institution of slavery and dominated late 18th century America. The loyal servant was constructed exclusively in relation to Sedgwick and her family. It was almost as if the radical difference between Mumbet and Sedgwick, between black and white, was erased. Notwithstanding Sedgwick's devotion, racial difference privileged Sedgwick and made Mumbet her subordinate. Mumbet was simultaneously Elizabeth Freeman, the African American who had challenged slavery's legality in the newly independent state of Massachusetts. It is Freeman whom Sedgwick celebrated in The Slavery of New England, a chronicle of the one African American struggle for freedom that she published in Bentley's Miscellany in 1853. Here, Sedgwick acknowledged the difference between herself and to Mumbet. Here, too, she inscribed Mumbet with agency. Having decided that the Declaration of Independence applied to all Americans, the slave Freeman had approached Theodore Sedgwick early in 1781. Won't the law give me freedom? She had asked, Berkshire County's most prominent lawyer, after Freeman enlisted Theodore as her counsel and challenged the constitutionality of slavery in the county's court. The law did exactly that. Freeman's achievement of Freeman established a precedent for slavery abolition throughout Massachusetts. Immediately after the court's decision, Freeman joined the Sedgwicks as the family servant. It was Mumbet's personal strength, her determination, her force, of all which she had been highlighted in the autobiography and journal, that made possible Freeman's public pursuit of liberation, an act that Sedgwick applauded in Slavery in New England. Sedgwick's older sibling also played an influential role in her childhood. Deeply attached to all her brothers and sisters, Sedgwick developed the strongest ties with her four brothers, Theodore, Robert, Harry, and Charles, sharing them with an intimate companionship, and I think as true a love of friendship that ever expressed between brothers and sisters. She considered them her chiefest blessings in life. Long after her childhood had ended, Sedgwick told a friend that she had no recollection beyond the time when they made me happiness. Nearly a decade older and already always away at school and college, Theodore had little impact in his sister's early years. However, the older brothers were a signal presence. Harry's loving, generous disposition, his domestic affections, strongly impressed his sister. Robert, designated as her favorite, served as protector and companion, and Charles, born 2 years after Sedgwick, was the youngest of the family, so held that peculiar situation to us all as junior. The status made him no less beloved. Charles, as Sedgwick made dear in her autobiography and journal, was a boy and Thanksgiving to me. But 14 and 11 years before her younger sister Eliza and Frances had a less divine influence upon Sedgwick's childhood. Both, as she recalled, were just of that period when girls are as dazzled with their own glowing future. The future was marriage, of course, and it was the relationship between marital union and sibling separation which Sedgwick remembered about her sisters. In describing Eliza and Frances, Sedgwick focused upon the separation occasioned by the marriage of the eldest sister. The ceremony that might have been regarded as celebration of the newly formed union left the 7-year-old Sedgwick with the impression that a wedding was rather a sundering than a forming of ties. Deeply upset at the perspective of separation from a sister who had played a maternal role in her early childhood, Sedgwick had cried at the wedding and had been taken away. Mumbet had tried to calm her, whispering her hush, but for the first time it was impotent. Later, the bridegroom, Thaddeus Pomeroy, had come to her and tried to soothe her, had said, your sister may stay with you this summer. 5 decades later, Sedgwick had not forgotten her reaction. My whole being revolted at that word. He had the power to bind or lose my sister. The significance of this incident cannot be lost in readers of the autobiography. Only 2 pages after she penned this impassioned statement, Sedgwick repeated it verbatim in a second description of the event. Both status and gender determined the education that Theodore and Pamela Sedgwick provided their children. Theodore, Harry, and Robert and Charles were all sent to preparatory schools that trained them in classical languages, then the basic requirements of higher education. With the exception of Charles, the brother all attended college before they became the apprenticeships as lawyers. Their opportunities marked them as sons of an elite family. Less than 1% of the male population attended institutions of higher learning in late as 1840. None of the female population did so, at least in the 18th century. Oberlin, which did welcome women, did not open its doors until 1832. The family standing also shaped the institution offered Eliza, Frances, and Catharine, each of whom was provided the most advanced education when available to women, were attended a series of private schools in New York City, Albany, and Boston, where their programs combined a smattering of academic schools with social accomplishments. Sedgwick herself sharply distinguished between her formal and informal education. Her school life, as stated bluntly in her autobiography, was the waste of my home life, my only education. This disclaimer notwithstanding, she did receive the formal schooling considered appropriate for the daughter of the elder elite. Having sent Sedgwick to the local school in rural Stockbridge, Theodore and Pamela sought other opportunities for her daughter. When Sedgwick was 8, Pamela wrote to Theodore that she had sent Catharine to Bennington, Vermont, as our school here is worse than none. The daughter's letters to Theodore suggest that this was at least slightly exaggerated, but in the autobiography, Sedgwick did say that there was, if any other school, a little more select or better chanced, I went to that. Whatever the particular school was, she noted wryly, our minds are not weakened by too much study. The demands were relatively insignificant, and this curricula restricting to reading, spelling, geography, and arithmetic. The family then enrolled their daughters in a series of schools in 3 different cities. Here, too, Catharine found the challenges slight, recalling the experiences of New York City with a mixture of levity and regret. She noted that at an early age of 11, she had been sent there and had the very best teaching of an eminent professor of dancing. Her schooling at Mrs. Bell's in Albany constituted in like fashion. Sedgwick recalled that Mrs. Bell herself rose late, was half the time out of the school, and did very little when in it. Considering the instruction she offered then, there that was made not have been a serious loss. In a letter written to her mother on the 6th of October, 1803, the 13-year-old Sedgwick noted that she had begun another piece of embroidery, a landscape. It was a very cultivated and a rather romantic appearance, but the daughter had begun to take a standing regarding the relative merits of her education. Little time would be devoted to embroidery in the future. She told her mother the study of geography and the practice of writing were much more important. So too were the mastery of the foreign language. In 1804, 4 years after she began French while in New York, Sedgwick wrote each parent describing her process in Miss Payne's in Boston. In November, she told Pamela that she was very well contented and pleased with my new situation, and that she was pleased as well with her French instructor, a very excellent one, I assure you. Nearly 2 years later, on the day after her 15th birthday, she answered Theodore's inquiry about her progress in French. I hardly find time to attend to anything else. I am very fond of it, and in my opinion, I have come on very well. Nonetheless, the cumulative experience was judged inadequate, and 4 years later, Sedgwick registered her intense and lasting disappointment in the autobiography. I have all my life felt the want of more systematic training. Although it was legally unsystematic, Sedgwick regarded her informal education as far more positively. Noting that her father and her brothers had uncommon mental vigor, she emphasized that their daily habits and pursuits and pleasures were intellectual, and I naturally imbibed them from a kindred taste. Sedgwick paid particular tribute to her father and read aloud to the family. She remembered listening to the age of 8 of passages of Cervantes, Shakespeare, and Hume. The father who read aloud also pressed the daughter to read to herself, telling her that he hoped she would find in your power to devote your mornings to reading. He reminded Sedgwick that hers was a privileged position. There are few who can make such improvements by it, and it would be lamented if this precious time would be lost. Sedgwick heeded this counsel. Indeed, the loving reader that her father had instilled in her became her education. By the age of 11, she was reading constantly, chiefly novels, and she was 12. Sedgwick added Rowland's multi-volume Ancient History, which included her to Cyrus's Greatness, Ancient Fair, included the increasingly popular children's miscellanies collected by Anna Babold and Arnold Berquin. Sedgwick then had little education in the common sense, but there was a particular circumstance in my condition in that some degree supplied these great deficiencies. There were particular circumstances. Sedgwick was basically untutored and undirected, but as the result of living in a cultured household, there was much chance she dropped in the fresh furrows, and some of it was good seed. She was also so bold to add some of it, I may say, felt on good ground. Sedgwick's metaphor highlights the paradoxical character of her education. Arbitrary, unstructured, and unpredictable as that education was, it had been obtained from a family that valued learning, considered the transmission of cultural responsibility a possession of birthright. Whether formal or informal, Sedgwick's education had not been designed to prepare her for a public career. Presuming that her daughter's existence would be centered in the home, elite families considered female education preparation for the role of wife and mother, companion to husband, instructor to children. The educated woman was expected to dedicate herself to her family. The ideal of the wife and the mother aside, the physical and emotional demands of domesticity made it difficult to imagine in other pursuits. Ideology and circumstances then located a woman within the household and made the role she played were central to her identity. Any career beyond the home was decidedly unlikely. In contrast to 9 out of 10 women in the 19th century, Sedgwick remained unmarried. However, the unusual status that had not made her eligible for a career. Instead, she was presumed that an unmarried woman would either remain with her parental family or attach herself to her siblings' family. Without the familial locus, the single woman's life was still defined in the context of domesticity. Nonetheless, Sedgwick challenged prevailing experience and expectation. Her siblings, female and male, played significant, albeit starkly different roles in her sister's decision to remain single. The experiences of Eliza and Francis's were cautionary tales. Each of their marriages made tangible a gender hierarchy in which the women were relatively powerless. The consequences of Francis was disastrous. Although Sedgwick described the marriage only sparingly in her autobiography, she captured its tone and temper in the single phrase, Francis endured much heroically. In letters written to her other siblings, Sedgwick elaborated upon her sister's desperately unhappy union with Ebenezer Watson. The reason for Francis's distress was simple. As Sedgwick wrote to Eliza about Francis' husband, Mr. Watson is brutal in his conduct to her and has for a long time rendered her miserable. With a demeanor that Sedgwick described as oppressive and essentially diabolical, Ebenezer tyrannizes Francis. Why then did Francis remain with her husband? That was so simple, Francis, that Sedgwick told Eliza in the same letter would leave him, but she could not bear a separation from the children. This was no idle concern. 19th century legislation governing custody of children in the events of the separation or divorce accorded the husband almost exclusive rights, like the complete opposite of today, huh? That fact made Francis's situation one of those hopeless miseries which over we must mourn without being able to remove it. Throughout the crisis that beset the marriage, Francis's brothers and sisters continued to provide sympathy and support. A resigned Francis remained in the marriage. Shortly before his elder sister's death in June of 1842, Sedgwick wrote a friend that Francis had been through a life of vexing trials and would be cooled any love, exhausted any enthusiasm but hers. The evidence suggests that it was only a slight exaggeration. In contrast to her sister Frances' experience, Eliza sustained a deeply caring marriage with Thaddeus Pomeroy. Nonetheless, this union as well entailed hardship. Eliza, Sedgwick recalled in the autobiography, had a hard life of it, indifferent health, and the painful drudgery of bearing and nurturing 12 children. Just as important, 19th century gender relations made the revolution of marital incapabilities Eliza's responsibility. Thaddeus, as Sedgwick described him, was a man after the old pattern, resolute, fearless, enduring, generous, with alterations of tenderness and austerity, of impulsiveness and rigidity. Unfortunately, some of these characteristics were trying to Eliza's gentle disposition and unvarying and quiet devotion to duty. 4 months before her sister's death in 1827, Sedgwick testified to Eliza's success in adapting to a marriage that resembled her parents'. Eliza was declared in her journals, can look back upon a life in which her duties had been well sustained. Her sister had been an example of a Christian daughter and sister, wife and mother, friend and benefactor. Sedgwick praised the obvious constancy and commended the effort well performed. Only later in the autobiography did she remark upon the cost. Only then did she locate these costs in patriarchal gender relations, while the experience of Frances and Eliza contributed to Sedgwick's decision to remain unmarried. Her brothers, of all whom welcomed her into their households, played the signal role, offering her affection and companionship. Theodore, Harry, Robert, and Charles provided their sister with a familiar base and made it possible for Sedgwick to create a marriage of circumstance. In a letter that she wrote when she was 51, Sedgwick told her close friend, Louisa Minot, that the affection that others gave to husbands and children, I gave to my brothers. She recognized that hers was an unusual situation. Few, she noted, could understand the dependency and intensity of my love for them. Developed in childhood, that dependency and intensity increased in the wake of Theodore Sedgwick's death, which occurred shortly after her youngest daughter's 23rd birthday. Writing to her eldest brother 10 days after her father had died on January 24th, 1813, Sedgwick told Theodore II that she longed to see him, longed to tell him that she felt for all my brothers new sensations of love and dependence. In the following decade, her father's death, Sedgwick, bound with two of her brothers, increased in depth and strength. Each of these relationships had its particular character and each particular expression of affection. Playfulness, remarkable wit, and charitable sensibility marked the intimacy Sedgwick shared with Harry. The unattachment with Robert was charged with passion. Writing to him 6 months after his father's death, Sedgwick declared, I do love you, with a loving surpassed at least the ordinary love of women. 6 years later, she described them as much of a part of me as the lifeblood that flows through my heart. Robert's declarations of affection were equally intense. His need for the equally strong, my dear Kate, he told her on more than one occasion, I know not how I could live without you. However, the trajectory of these relationships changed sharply in the 1820s. The years of mental illness that eventually cost Harry his life transformed all his relationships, not least the one in which he had established with his sister Catharine, beginning in 1827 and lasting until his death in 1831. Sedgwick's journal is filled with expressions of overwhelming loss. In one of the many entries commenting on Harry's deterioration condition, she lamented his darkened mind, his troubled spirit. He still another entry described once powerful broken as a broken instrument. The spontaneity, the clarity, the discernment was gone forever. Oh, it is too much. His sister cried out. Sedgwick's desolation was sharpened by the felt reality of yet another loss that occurred earlier in the decade. The reason was very different, although the impact seemed only slightly less. In December 1821, Robert told his sister that he had decided to marry Elizabeth Ellery. We cannot talk so close together as we have done, Sedgwick responded. The recognition devastated her. No one can ever know all that I have and must feel, because no one has ever felt the sheltering love, the tenderness, the friendship that left me nothing to desire. Despite Robert's efforts to dissuade his sister, Sedgwick tried to lessen her dependence upon him. At the time of his marriage, Robert complained that she no longer spoke in that language of the heart by which you are accustomed to faithfully so interpret its emotions. Nearly a year passed before Sedgwick felt suddenly detached to acknowledge that her reticence had been motivated by the need to have his presence and profession of affection become less necessary. The connection, the sense of reciprocal commitment established beyond sister and brother had been essential to Sedgwick's identity. Not surprisingly, she then process of disengagement had been extremely painful. Ultimately, Sedgwick achieved her objective of lessening dependence, although a deep attachment clearly persisted. After Harry's declining health required him and his wife Jane to leave New York City, Sedgwick spent her winters here with Robert and his family. She also traveled with him in Europe for 15 months, but the intimacy and the mutual reliance sister and brother expressed in their letters prior to Robert's marriage disappeared from their correspondence. Sedgwick herself alluded to the deference in her entry dated December 2nd, 1837. The passage describes the relationships with members of the family, including Robert, but the sentences about him having been carefully inked out. In the margin alongside the passages, Sedgwick added the following: on July 24th, 1846, nearly 5 years after her brother's death, here I had written a lamentation over the transference of the first place of my dear brother's Robert's heart. He had been my father, lover, as well as brother to me, and when in the inevitable concentration of a closer tie, I felt an aching void, I expressed it as I should not. Sedgwick immediately added, years passed on, and I had proved that the love of our early years, for a time, without its unusual demonstrations, there in their tenderest of hearts, the restored intimacy of Robert's gift to his sister in the final months before his death in September of 1841. The vacuum left by Harry and Robert were increasingly filled by Charles. The bond Sedgwick shared with the older brother, younger than herself, as documented in the correspondence that spanned nearly half a century. Theirs became a relationship in which reciprocity was perhaps the strongest hallmark. It seemed appropriate that Sedgwick, an individual who had constituted herself in relation to others, should be experience an exceptional mutuality in the siblings' relationship that lasted the longest. Charles endeavored to make my house, myself, my all as conclusive to your happiness as it is possible it should be. She emphasized that she had known nothing of love, of memory, of hope, of which there are not essential part. The losses and the shifting intensities notwithstanding, Sedgwick's deeply meaningful relationships with her brothers sustained until Charles' death in 1856. Still, in entry upon entry in her journal, Sedgwick considered the consequences of her decision to remain single. In each of her brother's marriages, she became the first of none, as she praised it in one of her early volumes of her journal. Being around second best was inevitably difficult. It caused her the keenest sufferings. It continued, constituted the chief misery of single life. And as she recorded in her journal, last entry on December 28th, 1854, she still felt so acutely and so unworthy and inevitable change from the time when I was the first in my hearts to being first in none. But if Sedgwick chose to highlight the cost of most of her entries, she also left meditations in her journal that located her choice in a larger and more balanced context. Yet she had suffered, she noted, on December 29th, 1834, the day after her 45th birthday, and her life's most positive dimension was openly acknowledged. For the most part, I can look back at my happy life. Her literary career had brought her far more of the world's respect than I ever expected. Her cherished friendships and continued undiminished through the years, the most important ties and connections upon which she had constructed her core identity had been more complicated. The marriages of her brothers had meant that a portion of what was mine to be diverted into other channels, acknowledged the pain that she experienced. She said resignedly, my heart had ached and does ache. Resignation was countered by the more resolute posture, however. She would not repine, she would not be exacting. And another entry recorded 2 years later, Sedgwick meditated upon the alternative. The death of William Jarvis, as one of the former suitors, provided the occasion. Whatever loneliness she had suffered, whatever pain her secondary status had entailed, Jarvis's death reminded Sedgwick of her conviction that a successful marriage required much more than a liking she had felt for the then young man of 25. It was not so much that Sedgwick regretted her decision to remain unmarried. Indeed, evidence indicates that she did not. And yet, a relatively honest Sedgwick meditated upon the consequences of her choice throughout her life. That she facilitated this time calmly accepting those consequences, the time lamenting them, suggesting ambivalence. But Sedgwick was no simple woman, and neither was her ambivalence simple. It complicated character she herself expressed concisely, profoundly, and perhaps unconsciously. From my own experience, she said, I would not advise anyone to remain unmarried. For she immediately added, my experience has been a singularly happy one. Sedgwick's brothers were central to the choice she made about marriage. They were no less important to their sister's literary career, strongly and consistently supportive. Theodore, Harry, and Robert and Charles served as their fraternal escorts. They encouraged the initially reluctant author, applauded the novels and stories, and negotiated with the publishers. In a letter written a decade before Sedgwick's appearance as a novelist, Harry displayed the enthusiastic with which he and his brothers fostered her career, telling Sedgwick that he had agreed to edit Boston's Weekly Messenger every third week. He dedicated that he intended to print a portion of the recent letter, a delightful scrap of yours on the sacred character of a pastor. In his effort to bolster the confidence of female authors, he needed the ammunition of a petticoated youth of high and early promise. None of the other of his sisters would provide the necessary armament. His confidentially shall I claim, far my fair countrywoman, you need of their genius, how triumphantly shall I prove this mediocrity of intellect. Harry confidently in his sister was manifest. He was too determined that to cultivate her talent, in ascertaining the country must no longer neglect the genius of its woman. He laid claim upon Sedgwick to display her own. Harry was also the first brother to persuade her to enlarge the form and scope of the religious tract that he had begun after she first left Orthodox Congregationalism for Unitarianism. Theodore and Robert then joined forces with him, and they convinced their sister that the novel that emerged from the tract should be published. Having read 130 pages of the New England Tale shortly after its publication in 1832, Theodore told Sedgwick that the novel exceeds all my expectations. Fond and flattering as they were, he had never doubted her abilities, and having seen them confirmed, his heart was filled with pride and pleasure. With the publication of Sedgwick's second novel, 2 years later, Robert delighted in counting to his sister that wherever I go, I receive compliments, felicitations, and even homage to the honor I have come to my relation to the author of Redwood. Charles rejoiced beyond all expression of the progress of the book as he was reading in manuscript. The volume of the time was hopelessly Sedgwick's third novel, which appeared shortly after the heartening letter of the spring of 1827. 3 years later, Sedgwick told more in mock horror than she must end her literary career, as his family will be ruined. Adults and children allocated, they're looked away in their rooms, absorbed with Clarence. Sedgwick's fourth novel, so long as each was able, all the Sedgwick's brothers stayed the course, prompting, bolstering, and persuading their sister that her talent demanded literary expression, dedicating Clarence to the brothers and to my best friend. Sedgwick acknowledged their signal importance to her career. Thus, we will end today for the introduction by Mary Kelley about how Miss Sedgwick's brothers were so influential in her life and career that actually promoted and probably gave her a career that she didn't want, but it kept her from being married. So it is an interesting story of the early women in American history. We will continue to read about this novel in future days. Please like and enjoy and subscribe.